Cinderfall is one of the more tricky characters to analyze in the RWBY series, as she has a couple of different abilities, but the way she uses them all revolve around creating fire or heat and have a bit of overlapping properties. So whenever she appears using her abilities on screen, it's sometimes a bit ambiguous as to whether they're coming from her Maiden powers, her semblance, or the fire dust woven into her clothing. So throughout this video, I'm going to try to break down what exactly her abilities are coming from, her semblance, her Maiden powers, or in conjunction with the dust woven in her clothing, etc. As often, at least it seems to me, she's using a lot of these in conjunction with one another. Now, first starting off, we know exactly what her semblance is called and what it is capable of, thanks to the RWBY the Official Companion that released last summer. Her semblance is named Scorching Caress and gives Cinder the ability to superheat objects, and by doing so, she can change their shape and even manipulate their density. And there is one episode in the RWBY series where this is shown very well, when Cinder didn't have the Maiden powers. The flashback episode when Cinder went around to recruit Emerald and Mercury, and then attacked Amber in an effort to steal the Maiden powers. And in that fight, she was using her semblance in a couple of different ways. She kicked the dust up from the ground and superheated it to change it into glass, that she was then able to launch at Amber to deal a blow against her. And after that, she used it in conjunction with her weapon, Midnight, the dual swords that she can combine into a bow, and she shot 3 arrows from Midnight, all of them landing around Amber in kind of a semicircle, triangle kind of shape, however you want to interpret that. But the second they made contact with the ground itself became superheated in those areas and exploded. An explosion strong enough to break Amber's aura. So what exactly I think Cinder was doing here was charging these arrows up with her aura to superheat the tips of them, so that when she shot them out and they made contact with the ground became superheated itself and exploded. I don't think this is a result of fire dust, because Rooster Teeth is honestly very good at having Cinder's clothing light up and glow whenever she is using the fire dust woven into it. So I think this was purely because of her semblance, and now we get to a bit of the confusing part, because very soon after, Cinder was able to steal part of the Maiden powers, but enough to still use magic in and of itself. And the first thing she did upon receiving this magic is repeat the exact same type of superheated explosion that she was able to do with her semblance, except this time without having to make contact or charge up her aura, etc. She conjured up the same kind of area of effects type thing underneath Crow and Amber, and caused the exact same type of explosion when Crow was able to dodge out of the way. So she's able to do and uses her magic in the exact same way that she uses her semblance. So this creates a bit of ambiguity going forward, because every other scene in the RWBY series, Cinder has had at least a portion of the Maiden powers, and it could be reasoned that a lot of the things she's doing could be because of magic. But one thing we do have going for us, at least in this analysis, is that in Volumes 1 and 2, the Maidens had not been thought up yet. Monty only came up with the idea between Volumes 2 and 3. This was confirmed in the Volume 3 commentary in the episode where the Maidens were first introduced, when Ozpin and Pyrrha were having their conversation, etc. So, in theory, everything in Volume 1 and 2 was solely because of Cinder's semblance in association with the fire dust that is woven into her clothing. Though some of it could have been retconned, but we don't have any confirmation on that. So let's start off with episode 1 of the entire RWBY series, where Cinder makes her first introduction. We see her clothing glow, and she's starting to launch fire attacks out at Glinda and RWBY. And one of the first things she does is create pretty much the exact same style of superheated explosion on the rooftop to blow back Glinda and RWBY. And this is because she's charging up the dust with her aura and sending that outwards. The dust itself is superheated and can cause the explosions that way. She's also able to use the dust, superheat it, and send it in kind of a heat wave outwards to destroy any debris that was in the area. Glinda was manipulating the debris from the explosions, and Cinder was able to do this to nullify the debris. This was, of course, association with the fire dust, but I'm pretty sure her semblance is being used in association with it in pretty much every scene where we see the fire dust used. Except at the end of Volume 1, when she's making that fireball in her hand, I think that's because of the fire dust in her clothing, though her clothing's not actually glowing at that point, and her semblance itself I don't think can create fire, so maybe this one is one of the ones that's retconned to be the Maiden magic, etc., because it's just, I don't think her semblance can actually create fire itself, maybe a shimmer of heat above her hand, but I don't think it can create fire, even though in later volumes she's able to create fire. We don't see the Maiden Eye power activate, so there's still quite a few things that are honestly still ambiguous. Moving on to episode 2, though, when Cinder fought against RWBY in the episode Dance Dance Infiltration, she used the fire dust in conjunction with her semblance in a new way. She was able to superheat the fire dust and create obsidian glass copies of her weapon, Midnight, which the original copy she for some reason burned in front of Adam Toros in the flashback episode of Volume 3, I guess deciding that she no longer needed her weapon of Midnight and could just get by without it, creating these obsidian glass copies. Now, I think this is because she was superheating the dust and creating these obsidian glass copies. They are very accurate, though, and very detailed, so there could be some magic in this, but I'm going to assume, because this is Volume 2, and also that her clothing was lighting up, glowing, because she was using the fire dust in conjunction with her superheating semblance, she was just able to have that much control over the shape, create the copy of Midnight, as well as the arrows that went along with it, and so when she fired the arrows at RWBY, it was the exact same thing as the fight with Amber. She superheated the tips, so when they made contact with the ground, it caused the explosion, etc. And in that same fight, Cinder was seen carrying a vial of dust along with her, and when she spread the dust outwards, she superheated it, transformed it into glass, and sent that flying at RWBY as well. So I think this pretty much fits with what Cinder's semblance is capable of. Now, the next time we see Cinder fight is all the way at the end of Volume 3, when she faces off briefly against Ozpin and then faces off against Pyrrha Nikos. And from here on, things get quite a bit more ambiguous, as Cinder has the full Maiden powers and has come to rely on them quite a bit as the volumes have progressed. Now, there are scenes, of course, when she's fighting against Ozpin where it's very obvious that she's using the Maiden powers, but she does use her semblance at least at one point during this fight. When Ozpin launches her backwards, she superheats the ground to slow her momentum and stop herself so that she can then use the Maiden powers and start counterattacking against Ozpin. And then against Pyrrha, well, things are kind of ambiguous here. She uses the fire from her hands to launch herself up the elevator shaft, and then throughout the fight with Pyrrha, she's also expelling fire and heat from her feet to keep herself floating. She's also using it to launch herself forward, but her eyes aren't glowing when she's doing this. Now, she wasn't capable of using this fire beforehand when she only had just her semblance and the dust in her clothing. Her clothing isn't glowing at this time, so it's probably a result of the Maiden powers, but since her eyes aren't glowing, we can't be sure. It might be actually a conjunction of the Maiden powers along with her semblance, but we just don't know. But again, Cinder did use her semblance a couple times in this fight. When Pyrrha had Cinder pinned, holding her blade, Milo, up to Cinder's neck, Cinder grabbed the blade and superheated it to the point where Milo broke. And it was just recently confirmed that when Cinder incinerated Pyrrha's body, this was not due to the Maiden powers. In Cinder's bio, in the new character that was revealed in Amity Arena, it states that Cinder actually used her Scorching Caress to incinerate Pyrrha's body, just showing how quickly Cinder can superheat things and how completely it can disintegrate something. So Cinder definitely had a lot of power even before receiving the Maiden powers. But then we get to Volumes 4 and 5, where things even more so become ambiguous. At the end of Volume 4, we didn't really see Cinder fight that much in Volume 4, but she's able to send out a fire blast and incinerate the hallucination of RWBY that Emerald conjures for Cinder, and when she sends out this fire blast again, her eyes are not glowing, though that seems very likely from Cinder's Maiden powers rather than just her semblance improving that much to superheat the air enough to create fire. I don't think, again, that Cinder can actually create fire with her semblance, but I could be wrong, and feel free to correct me in the comments below. Getting to Volume 5, this is when Cinder starts conjuring blades seemingly made out of glass, but having a glowing core out of thin air. This becomes what Cinder does for Volume 6 when she fights against Neo, and in Volume 7 when she fights against Penny as well. She's conjuring these blades out of thin air, not needing dust or anything to superheat and create glass weapons. They're just created out of thin air. And this screams to me Maiden powers, but maybe she's creating some sort of dust with her semblance to superheat it that way. I honestly don't think that's the case, and I would say that this is fully Maiden powers, but again, a lot of these instances, her eyes are just not glowing. So when she creates the spear that she ends up stabbing Weiss with, or the blades that she's fighting against Jean, at one point in that fight, Jean said, "Stop screwing with me." Cinder shattered the glass around the weapon, and it was just pure fire underneath, so yeah, that's definitely Maiden powers, but again, no eye glowing. Things are just a bit ambiguous here. Now, a lot of this is Maiden powers, and especially the fight against Raven, everything Maiden was happening there, but once it gets to Volume 6, this is when we see Cinder use her semblance a bit more, around using them with Neo. When Neo first appears and Cinder's fighting her, there's one scene where Cinder actually superheats her hand and punches towards the ground. Now, it could be that she's cloaking her fist in fire from the Maiden powers, but I actually think this one is from her semblance, that she's cloaked her hand in enough heat to create a flaming aura around it, punch the ground, and, you know, could deal a lot of damage that way. And then, of course, the fight ends with Cinder activating her Maiden powers and using wind this time instead of fire. And one thing I will point out, that every time Cinder's using the fire, the reason why I'm confused is because Cinder also used the ice ability once to freeze Raven in place at the end of Volume 5, and her eyes didn't glow then either. Cinder's semblance and the dust in her clothing is not ice dust. It's always been fire. Her semblance is superheating, and yet when she used the ice ability, which is definitely her Maiden powers, her eyes didn't glow, so just, you can see where my little bit of frustration comes with Cinder's character. But there are scenes that definitely depict Cinder using her semblance, and then it comes to Volume 7, the most recent volume where Cinder really only fought in the final episode. And pretty much throughout all of the fights, whenever she was using her fire, etc., her eyes were glowing, except in one scene where she pretty much created the exploding flame blade that she launched at Penny, and it exploded in her face. When she created that, her eyes weren't glowing, but she was still flying using the fire in the air above Atlas, so I'm pretty sure, again, that was Maiden powers, but overall, I've rambled enough about Cinder's semblance, her Maiden powers, etc. I've said my piece on all of the fights and scenes where we've seen Cinder use her abilities, and I would love to hear your comments down below. Do you think that what I've said seems pretty accurate, that overall Cinder's semblance can superheat objects? She can use it to create glass shards out of dust, and also in conjunction with the fire dust can launch fire dust outwards, superheat the ground, create explosions, or even create glass copies of very detailed weapons using fire dust and her semblance alone, using the arrows from those weapons to launch forward and superheat the ground in a similar way, creating those explosions. Now, one thing I will add to this is that in the fight against Pyrrha, when Cinder fired that glass arrow and it reshaped itself around Pyrrha's shield that she threw, I'm gonna call that Maiden powers, because I don't think Cinder has that capability just with her semblance alone, because that seems just a little bit broken, maybe? But again, let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully this video made sense overall, but if you did want to see some more RWBY content, RWBY theories, etc., make sure to hit that subscribe button, join the Guild of the Eternal Flame, tweet me at Phoenix Knight 7, join our Discord server, and I'll see you guys in the next video.